Hello everyone, this is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Very excited that Wayne Schulz is on the episode today, dropping some great best practices when you are implementing that next accounts payable or AP automation project. Now, if you want to discover his best practice and save yourself from getting too far into a project and figuring out then it won't work, keep listening. Welcome to episode 253, Best Practices for Your AP Automation Project with Wayne Schulz of Schulz Says. Today, I have with me Wayne Schulz, and he is an excellent guest today because just like me, he is a consultant that works with accounts payable teams, but there's a little twist to it. He has a very specific niche. And so welcome, Wayne. Why don't you talk about a little bit about your background and who you help? Because I think it's really great.
Sure. My name is Wayne Schulz. I'm over in Connecticut. I've been working with accounting in some way, shape, or form since 1986, which seems like forever ago.
Oh, I
came out
that.
of school in 86 and went to work for a local CPA firm, which was probably the best move working for a very small CPA firm, because I did a lot of hands-on working with various accounting departments, doing a lot of internal control work, a lot of helping people reconcile their accounting records with a real variety of different companies. But really, when you're working in a smaller CPA firm, it tends to be a good wide selection of small, medium, large type businesses. And it really let me get my hands dirty on how the behind the scenes activity works with accounts payable. And I did that for probably about 7 or 8 years, working as an accountant, doing people's audits, books, and taxes, until I moved about 1990 into working exclusively with accounting software. And at that time, and still today, I had worked with a product called Mass 90 accounting software, which was being very heavily marketed to accounting firms. And we signed up for it. And at the time, we had many customers that were using the old pegboard manual accounting systems. Remember, this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. So we, kept really busy back then, just converting them off of manual into this new, gee whiz, automated accounting software. So did that for many years, probably 5 or 6 years, just busy as heck, moving people off of the old pegboard systems, moving them onto computer systems. So I did a ton of work of just, geez, how do you make this transition from working with paper to working with automated? And that finally all became done. And now it's a world of basically helping customers where they need to upgrade their accounting systems, or they need to look for third-party integrations, things that make their existing accounting systems work even better. And that's a lot of work that I do now. I have customers that will call and say, hey, we're getting a new computer server. We need to move our accounting system over to that server. We're thinking about going and using a third party that maybe is going to do accounts payable automation, or is going to do accounts receivable automation, or is going to do paperless tracking of invoices, or we want to create customer portals. So that's a lot of working now with customers and providing feedback on what do other people use, how do they do it, what are the pros and cons, what are the pitfalls that we see, because we see a lot of it, right, when we work with different customers. So we see what some people do right, what works really right. We see what works really wrong. And in some respect, as computer consultants / accounting consultants, we're somewhat like doctors, right? We can recommend to people and say, hey, eat better and exercise. Maybe a third of the people do and the other 2/3 might not. They say, well, we're special cases. We don't need to eat better and exercise. It's just going to work out.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
But we still offer that same sort of advice and best practice, which I've sort of accumulated over the years of working with accounting software. So that's probably more than you ever wanted to know.
Well, you know what? So the listeners couldn't see, but when you were talking about the using the old style, right, the green ledger sheets, right, I was over here raising my hand because, yes, I started off on those as well. Sounds like, you have been really working with accounting and accounts payable teams since at the beginning of your career, but now you've been doing it on your own. And what I'm really impressed with is that you focus on one specific accounting suite or software.
Sage 100.
Right?
Yeah. And in the early days, I would tell people it's, the reason I like to focus on it is because when I first started off, and when a lot of people first start off in consulting, we didn't have as much remote work as we do now.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were one of my customers, you might be an hour and a half away from me. I spent a lot of time, and most consultants spent a lot of time in the car in the early days, just driving from place to place. So focusing on one specific accounting system allowed me to just get up and say, okay, I can answer your call while I'm in the car and fix your problem. Whereas I had 2 or 3 different accounting systems, I'd have to start looking stuff up. And so it was a little bit self-serving for me to focus. But long term, it really worked out well.
That's great. And I am sure that in that time period, right, working with the CPA firms and getting people transitioned from manual to automated, and then within those folks that have moved to, right, the accounting software now, right, integrating with AP automation tools. And so that's kind of what we want to focus on today, because I know you have a lot of experience in that. You kind of alluded to it already. Let's talk about AP automation and what some of the best practices are. But we want to start off with just talking about, right, the reasons for AP automation. And I know we've seen that especially increase since March of 2020. You saw some of the pitfalls, pain points, and garnered some best practices in AP automation. What are you finding that are the reasons that your clients are looking to automate?
Well, in my experience with AP automation really started exactly like you said, back in March 2020, right? My first memory of everything happening with this whole pandemic was March 2020. I was at an industry conference. And at that point, I kind of knew something was happening in terms of this COVID thing. Obviously not as familiar with it. And I was telling people that were coming up to shake hands with me, I'm like, why don't we just fist bump? Why don't, instead of shaking hands, why don't we fist bump? And people were looking at me like I was crazy. And then sure enough, right after that conference in March, came home. And then, within 2 weeks, things started shutting down. And the rest, I think people kind of know the story.
Yeah.
And I suddenly started to have customers who before were 100% all in one place, in one location. They had to scatter and suddenly work from home.
So I am very impressed that you actually got to go to your conference in March of 2020 because I had like 3 of them lined up and they all got canceled. I didn't get to go anywhere until the following year later in 2021.
I think we were right on the cutoff because I remember seeing some other conferences that were coming up and they were not that like a week or 2 away. Yeah. And it was touch and go whether they're going to be held.
Yeah, mine got canceled. So
if I was to sum up the whole reason that I got very interested in AP automation and why I think AP automation is one of the top sellers for integrations for accounting software, at least for Sage 100, it's 3 letters. WFH, work from home. Okay?
Yep.
Because my very first customer who took on AP automation, which they loved, by the way, was a small private school where they were housed in a building, which was not unlike a big old house. And they literally could walk out the door to see each other and say, could you sign this check or could you approve this check? And that all changed. Yes. That all changed in early 2020. And the customer contacted me and said, hey, we're thinking of going with this AP automation. What do you know about it? And what can you recommend? And it so happens that there was a great automation that worked with Sage 100. They got it all installed. And my one measurement about whether an automation or an integration is great is not how much money I as a consultant might make from it, right? I realistically make very little by the time you back out all the time. It's how frequently one of my customers will call and say, Wayne, thank you for recommending that. That's all I want. That's all I want. If I don't hear that, I'm probably never going to recommend that solution again. If I don't have customers call me and say, oh, that was great. Thank you. Thank you for putting me in touch with that particular integration. Here's some of the things that I learned from this customer. Like, I'm a big believer in telling stories about things because if I can tell you stories about what the customer actually told me, I think that's a lot better than just looking at a lot of PowerPoints that say, oh, we're going to do this or we're going to do that. Yeah. First thing this customer told me is they love that the AP automation provided them with a type of paperless office, right? They're all out of their office now. They're working from home. This AP automation that they used allowed them to file the invoices online, which they never had before. They loved that, loved being able to have those all in one kind of central filing cabinet as part of their solution. The customer said, geez, we have a lot of problems with approvals, right? It's a school. So they had teachers, they had people that were working on facilities, they had people that were working in marketing, and they were using credit cards. And before these bills got paid, they needed all of these people to look at the bills and approve them.
Yes.
And until then, it wasn't terrible, but it still wasn't great when they were all in one building. As soon as they started to scatter, these approvals really needed to go electronic. And that's what accounts payable automation, they told me what accounts payable automation really did for them.
Like a lot of the approvals, they were either getting like walking to the desk and getting approvals or approvals via email. And that email, we all know what's wrong with that. It's just fraught with risk. But even with that, right, approvals can get lost. People send multiple emails. It's just hard to keep track of, causes more work. And so even without the, pandemic threat and the thing that happened, that was still a reason to automate. But I am sure the pandemic helped those people that wanted to implement this AP automation tool, but couldn't get the budget. But all of a sudden now, everybody that WFH got them across the approval process to get the budget to implement that AP automation. So I'm sure it helped. But I mean, that's really always been like a reason, workflow improvement, and then also just not relying on email for those approval requests or even acceptance of the invoices, because it's cumbersome and it's just ripe with fraud. So glad that the pandemic had some positive effects, maybe on getting the budget approved for the tool.
Yeah, I think the pandemic was an eye-opener for a lot of people in terms of making improvements for their accounting systems.
So now that they've got the budget approved, you are starting to talk about how do you know and how do you recommend a third-party AP automation tool. And what you were saying is that you need to make sure that it's helpful, and hearing stories from your clients that have implemented. If they can't tell a positive story, then you're not going to recommend them. So talk about more about having those stories that you use as support for saying that it was a good idea to implement this particular software.
Sure. So the first thing, like if somebody comes to me and says, hey, what should we use for this particular integration, and continue on the integration of AP automation, the first thing I do as a consultant is I realize I don't know every single possible solution that's out there.
Yes.
So the first thing I'm going to do is ask my peers and say, what have you used and what's your feedback? And I call that sort of making the short list, right? Because in our business, we have some third-party integrations that, not in the AP area, but in other areas where we just know internally they don't work, like when we talk to other consultants. So I use that to kind of get a short list, and then we start talking to the various third parties. And one of the things I always advise my customers when they're going through and talking to people is say, when you get into that initial conversation with the salesperson or the demo team, the biggest thing that you want to ask them is say, tell me a story about 3 other companies similar to our company who you've recently helped with a problem similar to ours. Doesn't have to be the exact same industry, but they should at least be able to say, hey, look, we had somebody using whatever your accounting system is. We integrated it. They were in this industry. This is the approximate volume of checks they're doing. This is the issue they were looking to try to solve. They should be able to tell you those sorts of stories so that you get a relative comfort that this is, a third-party vendor that you can proceed down the road with. You just don't want to be there first in your industry doing something that's maybe very specific to your business.
Yeah, I like that you say you don't want to be the first. And I also like that, again, you really have that niche of Sage 100. And so when clients come to you, then you already have like that knowledge of what will or will not work based on your past experience. And then again, because there are always new AP automation tools, you do the research and then provide some advice on how they can select that third-party company. So I think that's really good. And do you find that really focusing on Sage 100 and their users, that it helps you in what you're doing as far as your expertise?
It does, because I get a lot of the same questions, right? So AP automation is very popular integration. So I get a lot of questions, and being involved to be able to say, okay, this is how it worked for this particular customer. This is what they liked. This is how hard it's going to be to upgrade when you come time to upgrade. Yeah. This is what the process is going to be. This is what I think you're going to end up paying. I'm a big believer, like when you look at these integrations, that you should also know up front, is this a $1 solution or is this a $100 solution? Let's not get 3 meetings into this, then all of a sudden hear that, this is a $20,000 a year solution when you thought it was going to be $100.
Yes, I love that you say that, because I have participated in those where the assumption is that if they just tell you what's in there, you can automatically afford it, and you don't always have the budget for that. And you may not even need everything that they have included that raises that price level. So great to hear you say that.
I usually, when I talk to my customers about pricing, I usually use the phrase starts at. Okay, because we usually don't have all the details when we're starting, but I know it's not going to be less than this. So I may say this kind of solution typically is going to start at X $1,000 a year, $100, and it could be more by the time you get through and talk about different features. And that at least lets them know if they're in the right room. And I've had more than a few occasions where people say, no, that's not us. No matter how much it does for us, we're not paying X dollars a year. And that's fine, but you found out up front.
Yes. Okay. So we have talked about reasons for automation. We've talked about, you've given some best practices for what to ask when determining third-party provider you're going to go with. So now you kind of touched on it too. Let's talk about some best practices after you've selected that third-party AP automation tool. What are some best practices for integration with that tool?
Well, first is to get in your mind exactly what you expect the integration to be. By integration, I mean, are you expecting to see full detail in your general ledger? And when I say full detail, does that mean when you write a check, will you see every single payee name in there? Is it going to just bundle it up and give you one number? Is that acceptable to you? Is that what you're looking for it to do? Just to sort of understand what that integration point means to you, as well as what the vendor is going to offer. I've seen a lot of times where the vendors say, okay, the integration is going to happen. We're going to give you a ton of spreadsheets. You're going to dump out all your information from your accounting system. So you have to stop and say, do I know how to get that information out? Is that information available in the way that the vendor wants? Or do I need to ask for some outside help to do that? Clear in your mind what they're looking for you to do. And hopefully by this point, your accounting system is in pretty good shape, because if not, you may have to undergo some cleanup before you get to the point of where you can get that information over to another system, whether that's a cleanup of name and address, contacts. I know with a lot of companies, if you've had somebody as a vendor for many years, it's not uncommon to have 6 or 7 contacts in there, half of whom may no longer work at the company. So be prepared to do a lot of cleanup. That's usually, in my experience, that's usually done in a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
The better you are with spreadsheets, the better you're going to be with the cleanup. So you're usually going to export out that data and send it over to your integration partner, and then they're going to pull it in. And that integration partner, in almost every case, is going to say, this is exactly what we need. Here's the spreadsheet. You need to give us a vendor number that is X characters long. You need to give us a vendor name that is X characters in length. So it's a lot of getting sort of that information ready and buttoned up to be sent over to your integration partner. And they usually have fairly short deadlines, right? There's a lot of things when you start working, depending upon the size of the third parties. Sometimes you have different people that you're going to be dealing with for different parts of the engagement. The person that does the demo is not the person that's going to pull your data in.
Right.
They're going to hand you. It's like tag team wrestling.
Yeah, you got to get the technical person on for that piece, for that integration piece. Yeah. And I will tell you too, I have been through that process a few times. And this last one, we were implementing a vendor self-registration portal. And, we had several different ERPs, and I had a team. And yes, we are going to go in and we're going to clean up that vendor data. So when we hand over, right, when we populate those spreadsheets, and yes, that is what we use, but when we populate those spreadsheets, all that information is going to be valid. Yeah, we never got to that.
Right. I have found that a good trick with these types of integrations, and I've been using it more and more, even with other projects that touch accounting systems, is to have a regular standing meeting.
Yeah.
So let's say every Tuesday at 11 in the morning, all the people involved with the project are going to get together, even if it's for 3 minutes, just to make sure you're moving.
Yes.
Because if you don't do that, depending on the size of the company, I've seen it where I don't hear from people for 3 months.
Oh, wow.
So if you can get buy-in from the company to say, okay, every Tuesday at 11 o'clock, we're going to all meet and we're going to discuss our progress, and we're going to discuss what's going to be ready for next Tuesday. It at least gives you little targets to say, okay, I know I need to be ready. It's a deadline. Whereas if you say, okay, Wayne, just call me when you got that list of vendors. Well, I've got 15 other things on my plate.
Exactly.
And I have didn't say call me by a certain date. Yes. Yet when I have these check-ins, that sort of puts milestones up there, even if they're not formal. And that has worked really, really well with me with customer upgrades, with integration projects, all that kind of stuff. It's just a regular check-in.
I think that is good, because a lot of times any meeting or any check-in at all, right, really triggers the fact that, oh, I needed to do something and like, let me do it. But if you didn't have that meeting, then it kind of gets pushed off to whatever is like the red hot thing at the moment. So I think that's a great idea to have those recurring meetings that are standing meetings, and you have deliverables as well, and then more likely to get folks to get those things done. Yeah.
I think it's worth saying, and I've been through a fair number of integrations during the
Yeah.
last 3 or 4 years. A lot of these third parties will come and say, okay, here's your account manager, and they're going to manage your account.
Yeah.
Let me be clear to you from my experience what these account managers are managing. They're managing for their company. They're not necessarily project managing you.
Yes.
They're on the call so they can report back to somebody at the home office to say, this is done. We can start billing them whatever their regular process is going to be. I always tell people you do need to have somebody internally who's project managing these projects. Don't rely on the vendors to do them. And the easiest way to do that, I found, is these check-ins. Because
Yeah.
then we're automatically kind of putting some skin in the game and
Yeah.
seeing where do we measure up against where we want to go on a weekly, could be a couple times a week basis.
Yeah. And on that note, too, in addition to making sure that you're meeting on a regular basis, is to make sure you have the right folks in the room. And then also, I love your point about the account manager on the third party provider side is really on the, they're there to support their company, right, to report back. But your side, you really do need a project manager, because the account manager on the company side doesn't know everything that you need to do. They don't understand what everything touches, who needs to be pulled in. And so you do need that project manager, which also helps, right, to keep pushing that project further, because you get a good project manager in there and they will crack the whip and make sure that things are done on a timely basis, just to make sure that things keep moving. And if it's something that you can't do, they figure out how to get around it or how to make sure that it doesn't affect something else down the road. And so when I talked about the last one that I was in, where we didn't get all the vendor master files cleaned, we got it to a point where it could integrate. Let me just say that. And that was due to the project manager, right? Making sure that they understood and they got us to understand what needed to be done in order for the integration to occur. Everything else was kind of a nice to have. We should have done it, but we made sure that it didn't hold the project up.
Right. And having those check-ins, I could now, say, hey, Debra, on Tuesday, I want to look at that list. Why don't you show everybody in the group? You share your screen.
Tuesday, I'm going to have that list ready because I got to show my screen.
It only took me a few times of that until it really came through to me that was sort of, it's not a formal way to project management, but it sure does get results, because nobody wants to show up and say, yeah, I'm not ready.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that you say show your screen, because just in other scenarios, when people say, right, yeah, I know how to do that. Well, go ahead, show your screen and show us. And then it's like birds chirping.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Been there too. All right. So any other best practices on the integration? I'm sure you've been involved in a lot of cutover weekends, which, we've all been there.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of like account reconciliation type work too with people where, let's say, the accounts payable doesn't balance in some instances to their general ledger. And what I'm talking about here is I always refer to the accounts payable aged invoice report, the listing of exactly what's due to people, as sort of my accurate balance, because I'm assuming that people are looking at that and agreeing to it. So no matter what the general ledger says we owe, I always kind of give a greater weight to the aging reports. And where I have discrepancy, I'll usually adjust to those aging reports. And if we're having a problem balancing them, I tell them, go through and balance them every day and call me if you come out of balance on Thursday or Friday. It will look for it, because it's harder to look for discrepancies that happened a year ago than a discrepancy that happened this week.
Got it.
Break it into little chunks.
Okay. So that's a way that you can move forward with the project, with the integration. If your GL and your AP aging report does not match, you can
Right. And
still
obviously, we
get
always
to
talk
that
about the degree
cutover.
of materiality, which is just a fancy way of
Yeah,
saying how big's the difference. If you're a $15 million company and you're off by $10, we're not even going to look at it.
right.
If you're a $100,000 company and you're off by $25,000, first I'm going to tell you to talk to your accountant because
Yeah.
I'm not in the business as a computer consultant of providing you tax accounting advice,
Mm-hmm.
but I can spot things that I know when to ring the bell and ask for help.
Yeah.
So when things start to become material, I start to be a little more worried about them. But that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that we can't keep going forward. I'll just create an account called unlocated difference and maybe make an adjusting entry so your general ledger does agree to your aging report.
Mhm.
And then we'll keep looking at it daily and trying to find where that difference came in.
Okay, that's a great tip. Okay. So they've integrated, cut over weekend period, whatever is done. They're in the new system. Now that they have that AP automation tool, hopefully you've gotten a call back to say, thanks for recommending it. It was great. We've gotten all of our workflows automated, right? AP approvals, no longer, walking down the hall, no longer getting them via email. And so all that is great. But you also say, right, now that you have that AP automation tool, you tell them to treat it a specific way. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I tell people that once they're up and running with AP automation is treat it also as a security tool, right?
Love that.
There's a lot of things that have been in the news about either fraud or practices that maybe were not as secure that have gotten into people's accounts payable departments and caused them to, redirect funds to places that those funds should not have gone. And it's with a combination of trickery, kind of social engineering, and just kind of loose practices within the accounting department.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing that I've seen in the news is we had it happen here in Connecticut. The town of New Haven had about a $6 million fraud where somebody apparently, as best I know, used a email account that had become compromised
Mm-hmm.
to go on and pretend to be the chief operating officer of New Haven and email the accounting department to say, hey, look, for this $6 million, and I think it was going to a very well-known vendor. I think it was their busing company for New Haven for school
Yeah.
buses. And they said, hey, instead of sending it to this ACH, send it to that ACH. And the person on the other end said, okay.
Mm,
Problem is it was not the correct ACH. Somebody had compromised the email. And because that request came in on an insecure method,
yes.
essentially email, that fraud went out
Yeah.
and I think they're able to pull some of that back. But in some cases,
Yeah.
when you make these wire transfers, it's not easy to bring that money back in. So I tell people the more that you can keep this kind of information running through your AP automation and not
Right.
via phone and not via email request,
Right.
because a lot of times people are not in the same office anymore. So it's not
Right.
that weird to get an email that says, hey, Wayne Schulz called and he really wants his check or he's not going to work. And we have to send it to this ACH.
Totally agree with that. When you have, especially when you've, taken the time to pay for, gone through the whole project process, implemented, right, this AP automation tool, use it. Make everyone go through that process. Don't do a separate process. We just got all the invoices out of email, right? Don't send a separate invoice via email with some new banking details on there, because that really just takes away from the fact that you've got security in a tool, but you're just not using it. And I actually am really against CEOs, COOs, CFOs, right? The C-suite, or even leadership sending an email and saying, hey, do something different than what your actual process is. That should really stop, so that if you do get an email like that, that's the red flag itself. The email itself is the red flag. And I can tell you, I've worked for small companies, I've worked for larger companies, and very rarely did I ever get, even even in a management position, right, an email to say, hey, go and do this. And if I did, and we had an automation tool, I kind of pushed back. And I know that can be, what do you call that? You can get, if it's legitimate, you can get some pushback back to you because they don't really understand why you're doing what you're doing. They think it's just easy. But, with the fraud risk out there, if you have a tool that can help you to avoid fraud, I don't see any reason why you can't push back and have them do that, even if they are the CEO, COO, CFO, right? They should be the ones that understand that they shouldn't do that. And they should make sure that if you get an email from them asking you to send a payment, that is a red flag.
Yeah, and in some cases, I think the AP automation can also help bolster that, because you can make it so that one person can't physically do all parts of the transactions. Right. Maybe there's one person that can add or change vendors, but they can't write checks, or they can't change the ACH.
They can't make the payment,
And I picked this up a lot. I've seen this really become implemented within IT departments. Especially if you do work with very highly secure ID departments in like medical practices. There really is not one person that I deal with at a medical practice that can do everything on the network. It is not uncommon at all for them to say, I don't have the password to get over to that other server. And that's just good segregation of duties, so that they cannot have an attack come at one person and get at the whole organization. And there's no reason that kind of security can't also apply to accounts payable departments, where the response to, hey, Wayne, or hey, Debra, can you just cut a check, could be, I physically can't do that because I don't have the access rights to do it.
Right. Agree with that too. And speaking of segregation of duties and avoiding internal fraud, I know that you know about that documentary out there for all the Queen's horses. It originally came out, I forget what year, but originally came out on Netflix. It's about an hour and 10 minutes, but it's all about how this finance director, I think that's what she was, perpetrated fraud for, was it over 20 years, because they didn't have the segregation of duties in place?
Yeah, so there was a woman, I think it was in Ronald Reagan's hometown. It was over a period of 20 years. I think her name was Rita, and I think she was able to get away with about $53 million. They recovered a large part of it from their auditors, who I think were found to be liable in some way, shape, or form. It's an awesome, anybody who works in accounting it's on YouTube for free.
Yeah.
All the Queen's horses. And she was the head of a municipality accounting department. And I think the way she was getting the money out is she had created fake accounts.
Yes.
And she was transferring the money into there. And she was also doing the bank recs for it, which is a big no-no.
Yes.
And she was found out one day when her assistant, apparently when Rita was out on vacation, her assistant had to call for bank statements. And before that, Rita always told the assistant, only ask for the bank statements by account numbers. And on this particular instance, the assistant said, well, I was so busy, I just called the bank and I said, send us everything.
Yes.
And that was the end of it. Because now, instead of getting 5 bank accounts, all of a sudden the assistant says, what are these other 7 accounts? I've got 12 here. And the other 7 were these sham accounts, which were named similar, that Rita was depositing money into, to the tune of about $50 million.
Wow. So she was not only distributing payments, right, writing checks, but she was also doing the bank rec. And that is a clear violation of segregation of duties.
And I think she was approving the invoices. They showed a number of bogus invoices. I think they went after the auditors for not catching some of the backup.
Yeah.
And clearly, like, AP automation helps a lot of that with the approvals. Doesn't help if somebody's making fake invoices. But again, you get back to separating your duties so that no one person is approving an invoice and writing the check.
Right.
If I'm writing the checks, I should not be approving the invoice.
Right. And in the P2P process, right, no one should have the ability to create or edit a vendor, also creating that PO and then posting that invoice and then generating that payment. Those should all be separated. And so in this case, that clearly was not done. And what's funny is, and I actually did watch it when it first came out, and I saw it though for the first time last week because it showed up in my, recommended documentaries, but it was on Amazon. So if you have like Amazon Prime, it's there as well. And I hadn't seen that before. I don't know when it got there, but I just saw it last week. So it's making the rounds, but I just remember being blown away because one, I think they said the neighboring municipalities tried to, talk to the mayor and other folks because the infrastructure of Rita's, right, municipality was kind of falling down. They weren't repairing roads, they weren't repairing bridges, where the other, similar municipalities around them were able to do that. And they were also talking, saying that, we've got this surplus, you guys are similar to us, you should have it, you should have that too. You shouldn't be running out of funds. And still no one did anything. And the mayor, I think, even said he thought it was, he knew that she had horses and had all this stuff that had a higher living than what she made as in her position. He just said he thought it was family money. So 20 some years.
She had like $1 million motor coach that she would school herself around to various horse shows.
Family
and they showed
money.
the barn, and as soon as you look at that barn, that was some family money, if she indeed would have had family money. I mean, it was like a palace.
Yeah. So I like what you say, treat AP automation as a security tool. And I will also say that if you have e-invoicing tool, right, if you've implemented that AP automation tool and you're still getting, right, that's for invoices, but you're still getting the vendor information, right, the, W-9, vendor setup form, vendor banking via email. If you have the ability in that AP automation tool to have the vendor upload into, somewhere where the vendor team can access those documents, you can still use it, right, to get that sensitive data out of email. So even though it may be the purpose of it is for an e-invoicing tool or something that's not related to collecting vendor data, as long as they have the ability to upload documents and maybe even messaging ability, you can still put it in there, have the vendors, because they're going to be in there anyway, uploading their invoices, checking the payment status. And so if you have a tool that has the ability to upload and maybe even messaging, get the vendor data out of email and have them upload it there instead. And that will expand its ability around security because you're getting it out of sensitive data out of email.
I've had customers come to me personally as well. It says, hey, we need to set you up in our AP automation system. And if you provide all this information, we're going to get you paid within 30 days. And for anyone that's not on this system, it's going to be a minimum of 90.
Oh, I like that. That's an incentive.
I didn't like it, but
I would have signed up, but I get it, right? Especially if you have a lot of clients, you got a lot of signing up to do, but at least you get paid earlier.
Yeah. So I suspect that was probably quite effective for them.
Yeah. So I know you've been through lots of AP automation projects. What is your best practice?
My best practice is going to be a new one that we haven't talked to before. And you're going to look at it and say, and anybody that's listening is going to say, oh, this is really self-serving. Wayne's really looking just to milk me for some money. But my best practice that I could tell anyone is if you're working with somebody on your accounting software, reach out to them and ask for their feedback and say, hey, we're thinking of using AP automation. Who do you recommend and why? And can you tell us some stories about people that you've worked with and whether it's worked well or not. I see day in and day out, and I have one right now, probably more than one that I don't know, where my customers go out and they say, okay, we're just going to buy something because we saw it at a trade show. So we're going to sign up. And I don't hear about it for 6 months. I liken it to somebody driving a car with another person in the car with them on a racetrack. And they're driving and they get up to 120 miles an hour, and suddenly that car is about to hit the wall. And they hand the wheel over to that person next to them, which is frequently their consultant that manages their accounting system. And they say, here, you take the wheel. Sometimes we can take the wheel and keep you on the track, but a lot of times it's going to hit the wall. Whereas if we're in the process from the beginning, and I will tell my customers straight up, hey, I've done this before and I can tell you stories. Or I'll tell them, I just don't do enough of it. Like one area I don't do a lot of work in is manufacturing. And the reason I specifically don't do a lot of work in manufacturing is because I personally believe that people that want to hire somebody to work with them for manufacturing consulting want to hear stories about what you've done. And I just haven't done enough with it. Reach out before you purchase, because the worst that's going to happen is they're going to say, I don't know anything about it. Now, if they try to sell you on, oh, I have to do some big study or whatever, I say, before I'm going to pay you anything, you're going to tell me a story about how you've done this for another customer and it was successful. Because if they can't tell me the story, I'm going to say, thank you very much. I just kind of wanted to do my due diligence by calling my computer consultant. And then I'll start doing my own work. But there's been a lot of instances where if people had called first, I could have told you on the phone in 15 minutes at no cost 3 or 4 things that probably would have saved you thousands of dollars, because we run into good, bad, indifferent integrations all the time. And the issue is people don't reach out and ask about them until it's too late.
And that is very good advice, because especially when you talked about, you talk with someone at a trade show, right, and think it's all good and great. But the folks at this trade shows, right, those are the sales folks. And they don't always talk to the tech folks that are building the product, that are implementing it. And so what they say and what can be done can be 2 different things. And so it's great to have someone to reach out to that has had experience in that particular area and get some advice on it. So I think that's very good advice. And on that note, let's talk about like where they can go if they would like to connect with you, those that have Sage 100, and sign up to get your advice at no cost on a weekly basis. I love your Schulz says. So why don't you go ahead and talk about that and let everyone know how they can connect with you.
Yeah, I have a newsletter that I do every Thursday. Comes out usually around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And it covers specifically Sage 100 accounting software, tips and tricks, maybe news releases or emails that the publisher has sent around that you might not have seen. I'm also a member of a large group of consultants where we typically trade a lot of information about what's going on with Sage 100. So I share as much as I can about the back hallway chatter that people may be having about current releases of Sage, various integrations. When I have customers that have really good experiences, I tend to share those and say, hey, look, here's a third party that one of my customers just went through and installed. They call me, they said they love it. If you're in a similar situation, you might, think about using it as well. And anyone can sign up for that. It's on the web. It's Schulz, SCHULZ. There's no T in there. SCHULZ, and then the word says.com. And you can just put your email address in there. You can leave anytime. There's always an unsubscribe link. So I'm not going to, spam you with tons of different advertisements or anything like that.
All right. And I'll be sure to put that in the show notes so that the listeners can just, click on it and go straight to that newsletter. And I've actually gotten, when we were introduced, I signed up for it. And I actually really like it because you've got all kind of, tips in there and back end information about what's going on with upgrades. You even had this last newsletter, which was at the time of this recording, it came out yesterday, Thursday. And so you even had in there about a new check fraud scam going around. So I like the content of the newsletter. It's great.
Yeah, we try to cover all the bases. Not everybody really cares to see how the sausage is made. Yeah. With respect to how accounting upgrades happen, and I understand that. So I try to put a little bit of everything in there to keep people interested that might be using Sage 100.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And stay tuned. Hopefully we'll get you back in here to talk about some new things with AP automation as it continues, right, to evolve.
All right, great. I enjoyed talking with you, Debra.
So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 253rd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy,